Chapter 40. The Emperor's Visit. There were times when guilt could be a very harsh mistress. It was 2.5 weeks now since the spy had been executed. Reyes, convinced that he had lost a good and close friend, would often just stand there staring into space, trying to think if there was anything he could have done. He was like the young boy who was beaten up by a bully, and who keeps reliving the incident, making small changes that tip the balance in his favour, despite the fact that the battle was lost long ago. Usually, Gaggara would appear and drag him off somewhere, or want to talk to him about something. Today, though, Agnart was the one who dragged him away from his thoughts. "You with us, Tamrag?" she asked. She tilted her head slightly to one side as she spoke. Reyes looked up at Agnart and gave her a quick, reassuring smile that he had heard her. "What's up?" "I could ask you the same thing," Agnart countered. She tapped gently on the handle that sat before him. "You're supposed to be turning that thing. I can put someone else on it if you need a break." Reyes looked at the spit sitting before him and the half-roasted sheep that he was supposed to be cooking. It had been his idea to be here. Since he now had the rank of chargeman, he could quite easily take a step back from the chores that all the others in his small group had to perform on a day-to-day basis. Reyes didn't feel right picking and choosing though. He enjoyed the hunts. He loved to fly, with his girlfriend by his side, and getting away from the hatred and oppression of the city for a few hours. He hated having to sit here and cook, but it was a small price to pay. Besides, he wouldn't feel right sitting back and relaxing while his pregnant girlfriend had to work. Reyes took hold of the handle firmly and began to turn it at a slow but steady pace. There was a clearly darkened burn mark along one side of the lamb carcass now, where Reyes had held the spit in place too long, but the rest of the meat should still be edible. Besides, once today's hunting parties got back, he'd be exchanging this meat for whatever they'd brought back with them. Agnart rewarded his cooperation with a smile. "That's it, keep the handle turning." Then she walked around Reyes' spit and headed slowly over to where Lagnoff was working. There were still times that Reyes was certain that Agnart was trying to steer him into her arms and her bed. As she walked away from him, she wobbled her hips ever so slightly and ever so seductively. "Have they told you what they're going to name the child yet?" Agnart asked once she was standing next to Lagnoff. "Why would they tell me? I'm only the grandmother." "Agnart is a nice name. Maybe you should suggest Agnart to them." Lagnoff laughed. "Sure, and when you have his child, we can name it Gaggara." "He doesn't want me," Agnart commented. "He's devoted to your daughter. Maybe we should work together to change his mind." "I'm not sure you really need help," Lagnoff said thoughtfully. "How do you mean?" Agnart sounded a little scandalized. "I've seen the quality of the girls you've been sending to our little group. Like little Limgag, for example, the girl who was effectively kicked out of her village. You're trying to make sure that if Reyes does fall for anyone else, it'll be you." "Is that bad?" Agnart asked. "I don't care," Lagnoff commented. "I'm almost too old for him. I'm not your rival." "Indeed," Reyes thought as he continued to turn the spit. There had been a few changes to the group recently. He had thought the main reason was because he had received a promotion. Agnart had moved both Caglin and Wallag to a new group. Agnart had claimed that she didn't want to lose Caglin's skill as a hunt leader, and though Reyes had tried to assure them both that he didn't mind following Caglin's orders, especially when it came to hunting, Agnart had feared a clash of personalities. Thinking about it though, Caglin was 12, and potentially a better match for Reyes than Agnart was, which some might see as a far better reason to keep the two apart. Reyes still had Gaggara and Lagnoff in his group. Lagnoff was in her early 20s, and as she had said herself, she wasn't much of a threat to Agnart when it came to Reyes. Then there was Gaggara. Gaggara was already with Reyes' child, so it would be hard to justify keeping the two of them apart, and might even prove counterproductive. The two girls who had replaced Caglin and Wallag were Narleth and Limgag. Narleth was a 23-year-old huntress who had had the job of butcher in her previous group. She seemed very happy that she had been promoted to the position of full huntress, now that she was with Reyes. The other was a new girl to the Hope, 8-year-old Limgag. Some might consider Limgag as quite a threat, but Agnart evidently seemed to think she was flawed in some way, a point she was quite vocal about on many an occasion. Limgag, on the other hand, was always trying to be helpful. She would often offer to do things that others would try to avoid. Reyes had the strangest feeling that Limgag was just trying to prove that she belonged. She wanted to be acknowledged as having some worth, and others would take advantage of her for that aspect. Reyes remembered the day that Limgag had been introduced to him. She had only been a member of the Hope for about 5 minutes, and didn't even have a bed sorted out yet. "I've heard of you," Limgag had commented excitedly. "You're the male that joined the Hope." "I am," Reyes had replied. "I didn't realise I was famous." "I wouldn't describe you as famous exactly," Limgag had said shyly, "but it's great to actually meet you." Reyes couldn't remember how they'd gotten round to the subject, but he did remember warning Limgag at one point, "Just so you know, I'm spoken for." Limgag shook her head in surprise at him and replied, "I said I was glad to meet you, not that I wanted to mate with you. I wouldn't insult you by suggesting that you and I—" Her voice trailed off. Eventually Reyes asked her why she had left her home to join the Hope. He got the full story. Limgag was a village harpy. She had made the point that the village was sitting on the side of a mountain and wasn't one of those that could be found in Harpy Town. The way she told it, she did not like the village life. She was often the odd one out, made to feel like an outcast by the rest of the girls around her own age. Sometimes they'd gone to great lengths to prevent her from achieving anything. She told stories of a time when she'd been cooking. There had been this young girl whom Limgag had always thought of as one of her few friends, and apparently this young girl had flown overhead and deliberately peed on the meat that Limgag was trying to cook. The meat was ruined, and Limgag, rather than the other girl, was the one to get the blame. The whole thing came to a head once Limgag went on her rite of passage. According to the way Limgag told the story, a group of girls at the village who had already passed their rites of passage pursued her, knocked her unconscious, and dragged her back to the village under the cover of darkness. Come the morning, she was still inside the boundaries of the village, and as a result failed her rite of passage. She would never have the right to call herself a huntress. The leader of the village declared that she was unsuitable to mate with the male. Limgag was given the choice of exile from the village or being given a permanent menial task of the sort that we usually reserve for those approaching or past 30. Limgag took the exile before they changed their minds and decided to kill her instead. Limgag was the group's new butcher, a position she had taken with relish, as it meant she belonged. Reyes continued to work, turning the handle of his spit and chasing away the occasional fly that tried to settle on the meat. Now that summer was over, there weren't many flies left, but there was still the odd straggler that was attracted to the smell of cooking meat. His attention was drawn away from the spit for a moment as an elf emerged around the corner of the nearest barracks house. He was dressed in the same brown uniform the other elves of the Hope wore, but the insignia on his shoulder marked him out as holding the rank of drakeman. It was an unusual sight to see anyone who wasn't a harpy hanging around near the fire pits, and it was virtually unheard of to see an officer here. The elven drakeman walked briskly to where Agnart was standing and asked, "Chargeman Agnart?" Neither he nor Agnart was standing that far from where Reyes was turning his spit, on top of which he made no effort to keep his voice down. "Yes," Agnart replied, somewhat defensively. She tilted her head gently to one side at a look of puzzlement and perhaps a little bit of worry in her eyes. "Good," the drakeman responded. "Dragonman Fenert sent me. You are to stop whatever it is you are doing here, gather your girls together, and then join the rest of the Hope on the drill ground in front of the barracks, where you will form yourselves into lines facing towards the main gates." Agnart looked at the elf skeptically. "Did our glorious leader say why?" The elf shook his head. "I can't say for sure, but I have my suspicions." Virtually anywhere else in the city, an elf asked such a question would have told Agnart to mind her own business, assuming he said anything to her. In the Hope, though, everyone acted pretty much as one big happy family. For the last week or so, the Emperor has been visiting several regiments about the city. You might think that he would leave the Hope for last, but apparently he has received advice that it would make more sense to visit regiments that lie close to each other, regardless of any other aspects. Agnart seemed to agree. "And today he's in this part of the city?" "I don't know," the elf commented, "but this morning Dragonman Fenert received an unexpected visitor, a rider in the uniform of one of the Emperor's couriers." Agnart looked about worriedly. Reyes noticed that she was paying particular interest to the sky. It was a nice clear day, perhaps a little breezy. If Agnart was thinking of escaping before the Emperor arrived at the compound, she could take to the air now, quite easily. "Do you have any idea how long we have?" "None," the drakeman replied. "I can't even be sure that that's the reason for this parade, only that I was sent to fetch you." Agnart shook her head worriedly. "This isn't good. None of our hunting parties have returned yet. It was bad enough that we still had 2 hunting parties out when the Inquisitors visited. At least they were willing to make allowances for us. I fear the Emperor and his retinue are likely to be a lot less understanding." The elf shrugged, saying, "I'm sorry." He even said it in a way that made Reyes feel that the elf meant it. "All I can say is that the Emperor isn't here yet. You still have time to send out some flyers and bring your hunters back." "If we knew where they would be," Agnark commented. She tried to keep her tone civil, but it was clear that she was feeling stressed. "Well," the elf asked, "how much longer are they likely to be? Maybe they'll get back in time. You never know." "I hope so," Agnark replied. She looked up again, and then back at the elf. The elf shrugged his shoulders again. "I hope so too. If they aren't at the parade, it won't just look bad for you. It'd be bad for all of us." The elf then turned and marched at a steady tempo away from Agnark. He turned when he reached the edge of the barracks house and disappeared round the corner. Agnark followed the elf as far as the boundary of the fire pits. Then she turned to address those working the spits. "Okay, I'm sure you all heard her. I want you to stop work at the spits, dispense with them carefully, and put the meat in a pile roughly where I'm standing. Make sure you smother the fires before you leave them." She looked at the nearby barracks houses, continuing, "I don't know who sleeps in here, but we don't want to risk it burning down, especially not during the Emperor's visit." Agnark then took a couple of steps forward. She seemed to be looking at everyone in turn. She nodded to herself contentedly. "I need someone to volunteer to wait here and warn the hunting parties when they arrive." Limgag raised her arm. "I will," she offered keenly. Reyes nodded to himself. Agnark could almost have been looking right at Limgag, expecting her to volunteer. "Thank you, dear," Agnark replied. "The rest of us should make our way round to the drill ground and prepare ourselves. Limgag, if you hear the Emperor arriving, you should hurry round to the front, regardless of whether everyone is back or not. Try not to make too much of a scene as you do." Limgag nodded her understanding. "Also, make sure all of our huntresses are disarmed before they join the ranks. Tell them the weapons will be quite safe if they leave them by the fire pits," Agnark told her. "I'm pretty sure the Emperor's soldiers aren't going to be too happy if anyone is armed." It was a long wait. The soldiers of the Hope were all standing in lines, much as they had when the Inquisitors had paid them a visit. The front few ranks seemed to have some semblance of order about them, but the further back from the front the lines got, the less orderly they seemed to be. Reyes waited patiently with the others, with Gaggara on his right and Agnark on his left. Lagnov was standing just on the other side of Gaggara, while Narlev was just on the other side of Agnark. Dragonman Finert and his ever-attendant assistant Wormman Frayne stood out in front of the ranks, looking impatiently towards the gate. As per normal, there were 2 soldiers on duty at the gate this morning. This time they were both goblins. One of the 2 goblins was marked with the Yagnokken loyalty tattoo, while the other had no tattoo of any description on his face, suggesting that he had most likely been born into captivity. They kept glancing back towards the Dragon Man, and then out onto the street that ran alongside the Hope's compound. There seemed to be no sign of the Emperor or any of his retinue. The hours passed. Harpy legs weren't much good for walking or running, but surprisingly they were quite well adapted to standing, although they preferred to be perched with their talons curled around a convenient bough of some description. Some time after the 2nd hour, the first group of huntresses returned. As they flew overhead, they exchanged puzzled comments with each other as to what was happening below. Reyes turned his head, straining to see what was happening. The hunting party had landed somewhere close to the fire pits and out of sight. A few minutes later, Limgag must have explained the situation to them, for they were emerging from between a couple of barracks houses. Just as Agnark had asked, Limgag had gotten them to leave their weapons behind at the fire pits. Another hour passed, and there was still no sign of the Emperor, but the remaining hunting parties had returned, and shortly they too joined the ranks of those waiting. "Limgag has done a good job," Agnark commented approvingly. Reyes nodded his agreement. For a girl singled out by others of her village as nothing more than a loser and a waste of space, she actually seems quite capable. "Agreed," Agnark commented. Then a few seconds later she posed the question, "Did you see her emerge with that last hunting party?" "I didn't," Reyes admitted, "but then I wasn't really looking." Agnark sighed. "I'll bet she's still round there." "Want me to go and check?" Reyes asked. Tanrag, Agnark muttered. "You really have to learn that now you're a chargeman in the Hope. You need to delegate tasks to others. We can send Gaggara, or Narlev, or Lagnov." "I think I'd rather send Narlev," Reyes commented. "What?" Narloff protested. Gaggara is one of your girls, and Lagnoff is her mother, so that means I'm stuck with all the menial duties? She has a point, Agnot said. Fine, Reyes replied. He felt a little angry. What was the point in asking him if no one was going to listen? Fine, you decide. But if Gaggara goes, I go with her. Agnot shrugged. Narloff or Lagnoff then? Any volunteers? Since Narloff had already voiced her opinion, Agnot had looked straight at Lagnoff as she spoke. Nobody answered. Got a coin? Agnot asked Reyes. Reyes flipped open the money pouch of his belt, and from it he took a small silver-coloured coin, a 5 dirhem piece, that he handed to Agnot. I'll want that back. Agnot took the coin and turned her attention to Narloff. Heads, Narloff commented before being asked. Reyes looked on with surprise. He had seen elves play this game on the street. Usually it was in the form of some sort of gamble. Elves seemed willing to gamble on anything. However, since harpies rarely seemed to carry any money, he was more than a little surprised to find that either Agnot or Narloff would know how to play it. Agnot flipped the coin into the air and then tried to stand back and let it land unhindered in front of her. This seemed to be a slight difference to the elven game. Elves usually caught the coin on its way down, and then, without looking at it, they would smack it against a flat surface, such as a table. On this occasion, the coin had clearly landed heads up. It was the wonderful face of their beloved emperor looking up at them from the back of the coin. Agnot made no effort to retrieve the coin. Instead, she turned towards Lagnoff. Lagnoff, darling. Yes, Lagnoff replied grumpily. I know. I'm on my way. Lagnoff began to thread her way towards the back of the crowd. It wasn't an easy task. Some of the soldiers had gathered so close together that there was simply no gap, and though she was able to request that they let her through, it sometimes took 2 or 3 requests before she got anywhere. Reyes and Gaggara both watched Lagnoff as she made her way to the back of the ranks. Then she disappeared out of sight. When she re-emerged a few minutes later, Limgag was walking beside her. Reyes felt a little strange as the soldiers, especially the other harpies, began to fall silent around him. Even when the Inquisitors had been here, the ranks of the Hope had never gotten this quiet. Slowly, he became aware that Gaggara was no longer looking towards the back of the ranks, but was now facing forward towards the gates of the compound. Reyes wanted to make sure that both Lagnoff and Limgag had made it to the rear ranks, but instead he felt almost compelled to turn the focus of his attention towards the compound's gates. There was no sign of anyone at the gates. No soldiers in dull blue uniforms, no young elven boys in bright golden robes. Nothing to suggest that anything of import was about to happen. Except for the music. It was magnificent music. Powerful music. Regal music. It got louder and louder every second that passed. This was the Emperor's music. Played by a specially commissioned brass band, it preceded the Emperor wherever he went, almost as if to warn the population to get out of his way before they were crushed beneath the might of his Imperial Majesty. The brass band was first to enter through the gates. They were resplendent in their red and purple uniforms, each wearing the chainmail armour that Reyes had come to associate with elven soldiers, and each armed with a longsword carried at the waist. If necessary, the members of the band were quite capable of fighting to defend their emperor. Once through the gate, the band headed towards the left of the compound. Reyes assumed it was because there was more room to the left than there was to the right. They continued playing out of the way of the gates. Next were about 20 soldiers in the dull blue uniform of the Emperor's personal guard. These men wore plate armour breastplates, but little else in the way of protection. They marched in line. Although they must have seen the undisciplined mess of soldiers that was the Hope, there was no register of it in their expressions. These soldiers divided themselves into 2 even groups and formed an honour guard about the gate. Then the Emperor himself arrived. He was an extremely fat man, dressed only in a silken purple robe with a golden border and golden filigree decorations. It looked as if he had taken no care at all in getting dressed that morning, and it was just hanging loosely about his body. 4 trolls, clearly slaves, carried the Emperor on the back of a palanquin. He sat on a very large pile of cushions, while in front of him was a silver bucket containing bunches of grapes, which the Emperor ate almost constantly, staining his lips a messy shade of purple. To the left, and to the right of the palanquin were a couple of young boys dressed in golden robes, and each flanked by 2 more soldiers in dull blue uniforms. The eldest of the 2 boys, the one to the left of the palanquin from Reyes's point of view, seemed to be holding his hands together as if in prayer. The other walked casually, with his hands to his sides. There was more. Behind the Emperor, following the palanquin closely on the left-hand side, was a balding, white-haired elf in a long grey robe that bore no decorations whatsoever. He was carrying a steel-shod wooden staff that he used like a walking stick. Darty, Reyes thought to himself, the Emperor's mage advisor. Immediately behind the old elf were 4 other mages. They wore the long red woolen robes of the Inquisitors, and each of them was flanked by 2 shield bearers. Behind them there were another 3 dozen dull blue clad soldiers, and these ones carried longbows. Once again a mad thought struck Reyes. The Emperor was here now, in easy striking distance. A determined harpy could strike him down in a single blow. He, Reyes, could end the war before it even began. He let the thought float away from him. For one thing, it would mean his own life, and though he didn't mind that too much, it might also mean the life of Gaggara and her unborn child. Besides, what if whoever was next in line for the throne was even worse? Reyes had no idea who would replace the current ruler as Emperor. As far as he was aware, the Emperor had no children. In fact, if Reyes understood it correctly, he wasn't likely to ever have any children. The Emperor simply wasn't attracted sexually to adults. Suddenly, the Emperor began to speak. His voice sounded almost effeminate, amplified hundreds of times by a similar type of magic to that the Inquisitors must have used. At the beginning of virtually every sentence, he made a strange noise, as if there was a nasty smell under his nose. Soldiers of the Emperor started and then paused. The old elf poked his head in the side of the palanquin and said something to the Emperor. The Emperor nodded, sniffed loudly and said, "Soldiers of the 421st Hope, we want you to know that we are glad to have you among our army. In 6 days' time we will begin our much anticipated invasion of Florif. You are but one cog amongst many who will hope to see our plan through. We expect to see you all do your best for your Emperor and for the greater glory of the Elven Empire." He spoke the last few words almost as if it was intended as some sort of battle cry. If the Emperor had expected his comment to elicit a cheer from those gathered in the compound, he was greatly mistaken. There was a slight murmuring, but nothing else. Finally, Reyes thought to himself. Now he had the date of the invasion. He thought about it for a minute. 6 days? They were planning the invasion on the day of his sister's wedding. That was bad. He had to get away. He had to warn his brothers that the elves were coming. There was a high chance that his brothers might already have left for the capital. Reyes would have to choose between pursuing them along the King's Highway and risking a visit to the castle to talk to either Mangloss or Sir Richmond. Surely one of those wise old men would know how to handle this. The Emperor was still talking. "I have it on good authority that we will meet with very little resistance. The Duke of what they call the Moth is currently in a cell in their capital, and every other Duke is going to be summoned to a party at the palace on that day, and they will be taking many of their soldiers with them." Reyes was beginning to feel a little restless. There was nothing he could do, at least until night fell. Even then it would be hard to get out with the curfew in force and the eyes in the sky on the lookout for every tiny incursion. Reyes could hear Agnart muttering to herself beside him, and he turned to look at her. She seemed to notice his eyes on her, because then she whispered, "It'll be an easy fight all the way to the capital, but then we'll be up against nearly every soldier in the country, all gathered in one place." Reyes nodded and turned back to face the front. The Emperor was winding up his speech. "I wish you good luck in the upcoming invasion, and I want you to know that my best wishes go with all of you." He then reached into the bucket and pulled a fresh bunch of grapes from it. The soldiers of the Hope remained silent. Reyes wondered what was going on. Admittedly, it hadn't been one of the most motivating of speeches. For one thing, it had been very short. It was a long way for the Emperor to travel just to say so few words, yet there was a sense of something else in the air. It was as if the soldiers of the Hope were anticipating something more. "What is it?" Reyes whispered to Agnart. Agnart turned her head only slightly and whispered back, The Emperor rarely leaves anywhere without making an example of someone. Now keep quiet, lest it be you." "That must be very demoralizing," Reyes commented. "Shush," Agnark replied.